Welcome to Unwrap Reality, where we narrate stories on things that happen in real life.
What happens when love turns into betrayal and your happily ever after becomes a public spectacle? This is the story of how I walked down the aisle ready to marry my fiancé, only to leave alone, stronger than ever, with $50,000 in my pocket and revenge on my mind. But let me start at the beginning, because this isn't just a tale of heartbreak. It's about taking back control in the most unexpected way. I'll admit, planning a wedding wasn't easy. Between choosing flowers, tasting cakes, and arguing over guest lists, there were days when I wondered if Daniel, the man I thought was the one, was worth all the stress. Still, I pushed through, believing that our life together would make every headache worthwhile. That belief lasted right up until 3 days before the big day, when I found something I never wanted to see: explicit texts between Daniel and Sophie, my maid of honor. My stomach dropped as I scrolled through their messages, each word confirming what I'd been too afraid to confront: a months-long affair hiding behind fake smiles and whispered lies. Instead of confronting them, though, I decided to play along. They didn't know I knew, and I planned to use that to my advantage, in front of everyone we knew. The morning of the wedding felt surreal, like I was living someone else's life instead of my own. There I was, standing in front of a mirror in my white dress, knowing full well that the man waiting for me at the altar had already broken his vows, to me and to us. Yet, outwardly, I played the part of the blissful bride perfectly. When Daniel came into the bridal suite to wish me luck, he kissed my cheek and told me how beautiful I looked. His words were sweet, but they left a bitter taste in my mouth. I smiled back, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. Inside, I was seething, but outside, pure calm. I couldn't let him, or Sophie, suspect anything. Not yet. Sophie arrived soon after, fussing over my veil like nothing was wrong. She even joked about how nervous Daniel seemed, saying, "He's probably worried you'll change your mind." If only she knew. Every laugh she forced, every compliment she gave, felt like salt in an open wound. But I kept my composure, nodding along and pretending everything was fine. Meanwhile, I double-checked the slideshow presentation I'd prepared, a damning collection of screenshots, timestamps, and incriminating photos, all set to air during the ceremony. No one suspected a thing. Sophie adjusted my train, humming softly as though this was just another ordinary day. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she'd gotten away with it. That she and Daniel could keep their secret hidden forever. Little did they know, their lies would soon be exposed in front of everyone who mattered. As I stood in the hallway moments before walking down the aisle, my best friend hugged me tightly and whispered, "You've got this." And for the first time since finding out about Daniel and Sophie, I believed her. I wasn't walking down that aisle to marry him anymore. I was walking down to expose them, to turn their secret shame into public humiliation. And honestly, I couldn't wait. My heart raced, not from nerves, but from anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about reclaiming my power. For months, maybe even years, I doubted myself, wondering if I was being paranoid or overly sensitive whenever something about Daniel didn't sit right. Now, armed with proof and a plan, I realized none of that mattered anymore. Today wasn't about them winning, it was about me taking back control. As the music began to play and the doors opened, I took a deep breath, ready to face the crowd, and more importantly, ready to watch Daniel and Sophie squirm under the weight of their betrayal. The moment the doors opened, I felt every eye in the room turn to me. The soft strains of the wedding march filled the air, and for a second, I almost forgot why I was really there. Almost. As I stepped forward, my heels clicking against the marble floor, I scanned the crowd. Friends, family, coworkers, all gathered to witness what they thought would be the happiest day of my life. None of them had any idea what was coming. My gaze landed on Daniel first. He stood at the altar, tall and handsome in his tuxedo, smiling nervously as he waited for me to join him. For a split second, I felt a pang of sadness, not for losing him, but for the future we dreamed of that would now never exist. Then I looked past him to Sophie, seated in the front row, fanning herself with her program like she didn't have a care in the world. Seeing her there, so smug and oblivious, reignited the fire inside me. This wasn't just about heartbreak anymore, it was about justice. Every step I took down that aisle felt heavier than the last, but not because of regret. It was the weight of everything I'd been through, the late-night suspicions, the gut-wrenching discovery, the sleepless nights spent planning this very moment. But I held my head high, letting the illusion of happiness mask the storm brewing beneath the surface. People whispered around me, their voices blending into a low hum. "She looks stunning," someone said. Another murmured, "They're such a perfect couple." If only they knew. With each step closer to the altar, I could feel the tension building inside me, coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. By the time I reached Daniel, I was practically vibrating with energy. He reached out to take my hand, his smile warm and genuine. For a brief moment, I wondered if he truly believed I still loved him, or if somewhere deep down, he suspected I knew. Either way, it didn't matter. In a few minutes, his world would come crashing down. The officiant began speaking, his voice echoing through the venue as he welcomed everyone and launched into the traditional opening remarks. I barely heard a word. My mind was racing, replaying the plan over and over in my head. I glanced at the projector screen set up discreetly near the altar, knowing exactly what would appear on it when the time came. Beside me, Daniel shifted slightly, clearly eager to get to the vows. He had no idea those vows weren't going to happen. Instead, something far more memorable was about to unfold. As the officiant paused and gestured for us to face each other, I realized the moment was finally here. This was it, the point of no return. My heart pounded in my chest, but I felt eerily calm, like I'd already won. Because I had. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain. Daniel and Sophie's lies wouldn't survive the hour. And neither would our relationship. Just as the officiant began to speak the words, "Who gives this woman to be married?" I raised my hand, not to answer, but to stop him mid-sentence. The room fell silent, confusion rippling through the crowd like a wave. I turned to face everyone, gripping the microphone with both hands. My voice was steady, almost eerily calm, as I said, "Before we go any further, there's something you all need to know." Gasps echoed around the room, and I could see Daniel stiffen beside me. His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic that he quickly tried to hide. Sophie, seated in the front row, shifted uncomfortably, her fan now frozen mid-motion. I didn't waste time easing into it. With one click of the remote in my hand, the projector screen lit up, displaying the first screenshot, a steamy text exchange between Daniel and Sophie, dated weeks before our wedding day. Murmurs erupted from the guests as they read the messages aloud to each other, their disbelief turning into shock. I scrolled through more evidence, photos of them together, timestamps proving their lies, all while keeping my focus on the crowd. "This is why we're not getting married today," I announced, my tone sharp enough to cut glass. Daniel's face turned pale, his jaw dropping as he realized what I'd done. Sophie buried her face in her hands, her carefully styled hair now shielding her from the hundreds of eyes glaring at her. The room buzzed with chaos, but I wasn't finished yet. I leaned closer to the mic, ensuring my next words carried clearly to every corner of the venue. For months, maybe even years, I trusted these two people more than anyone else in my life. And for months, they betrayed me behind my back. I paused, letting the weight of my statement sink in. Some guests sat in stunned silence. Others whispered angrily about the audacity of it all. Daniel finally found his voice, stammering, "Jesse, please, let me explain." But I cut him off before he could say another word. "Save it," I said, my voice cold and final. "Your explanations don't matter anymore." As Daniel stumbled over his words, trying desperately to salvage the situation, I could see the cracks forming in his carefully constructed facade. Sophie, on the other hand, had completely unraveled. Her cheeks were flushed red, tears streaming down her face as she buried her head in her hands, unable to look anyone in the eye. It was almost poetic, watching them squirm under the weight of their own betrayal. But this wasn't just about making them pay, it was about reclaiming my power. I took a deep breath, letting the chaos around me settle for a moment before speaking again. "You two thought you could keep this hidden forever," I said, my voice cutting through the murmurs like a knife. "But today, everyone gets to see exactly who you really are." Then came the part I'd been waiting for, the twist that would leave them both speechless. I turned back to the microphone and delivered my next announcement with a smile that felt equal parts triumphant and liberating. "The $50,000 we saved for our honeymoon? Yeah, I'm keeping it. But don't worry, it's not going toward anything you'll benefit from." I paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build before continuing. "Instead, I'm using it to take myself on the trip of a lifetime. 6 months, 12 countries, 0 regrets. And trust me, I'll make sure every single dollar reminds me how much better off I am without either of you." The room erupted into gasps and cheers, some guests clapping enthusiastically while others stared at Daniel and Sophie with undisguised disgust. For the first time since discovering their affair, I felt truly free. Watching Daniel's face twist in disbelief and then anger was worth every sleepless night I'd endured planning this moment. He opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. What could he say? Every lie, every secret was now laid bare for everyone to see. Sophie, meanwhile, looked like she wanted to disappear entirely. She tried to stand up and leave, but the crowd blocked her path, their judgment pinning her in place. As the reality of what I'd done sank in, I realized something important. This wasn't just revenge, it was liberation. For years, I'd tied my happiness to Daniel, believing he was my future. Now, standing there in front of everyone, I knew the truth. My future belonged to me alone. The room was electric with tension, a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief rippling through the crowd. Daniel finally found his footing, or at least he tried to. "Jesse, this isn't what it looks like," he stammered, his voice trembling as he reached for my arm. I stepped back instinctively, refusing to let him touch me. His attempt at damage control only made things worse. "We can fix this," he pleaded, his eyes darting around the room, searching for allies who weren't there. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. The murmurs grew louder, some guests audibly scoffing at his words. A few even shouted, "Save it, man," or "You're pathetic." Watching him squirm under the weight of his own lies was almost satisfying enough, but I wasn't done yet. Sophie, on the other hand, had completely broken down. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a loud screech that silenced the room for a brief moment. "I'm sorry," she blurted out, her voice cracking as tears streamed down her face. "It just happened. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Her apology fell flat, met with glares and mutters from the guests who now saw her for what she truly was. One of my aunts shouted from the back, "How dare you show your face here after what you've done?" Sophie's hands flew to her mouth as if she could take the words back, but it was too late. The damage was done, and there was no escaping the public humiliation she'd brought upon herself. As the chaos unfolded around them, I took a step back, observing the scene with a strange sense of detachment. This was their mess now, not mine. I'd exposed the truth, taken back what was rightfully mine, and turned their betrayal into my triumph. But the best part? They were left to clean up the wreckage in front of everyone they knew. Friends, family, coworkers, all of them would remember this day not as the wedding that never happened, but as the moment Daniel and Sophie's lies came crashing down. And honestly, I couldn't have scripted it better myself. With one final glance at the two people who had once meant everything to me, I turned on my heel, ready to walk away from the ruins of a life I no longer wanted. As I walked down the aisle for the second time that day, it felt nothing like the first. This time, there was no trembling uncertainty, no lingering doubt about what lay ahead. Instead, I moved with purpose, my head held high and my heart lighter than it had been in years. The guests parted for me, some clapping, others whispering words of encouragement. "You've got this, Jesse," one woman called out, while another simply said, "Good for you." It wasn't just support, it was validation. For so long, I'd questioned myself, wondering if I'd imagined the signs or overreacted to harmless coincidences. But now, surrounded by people who saw Daniel and Sophie for who they truly were, I realized I hadn't been wrong to trust my instincts. I'd been right to listen to them. Outside the venue, I paused for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over me. My heels clicked against the pavement as I made my way to the valet stand, but before I reached it, I stopped and kicked them off entirely. I didn't need them anymore. Those shoes had symbolized everything I thought I wanted, but now I wanted freedom. Freedom from lies, from betrayal, from settling for less than I deserved. As I slipped into a pair of sneakers I'd stashed in the car earlier, I couldn't help but laugh. Here I was, standing outside my canceled wedding, feeling more alive than ever. Friends and family began spilling out of the venue behind me, offering hugs and kind words. Some even joked about throwing an impromptu party instead, a celebration of independence rather than matrimony. And honestly, I loved the idea. With the top down on my convertible and music blasting through the speakers, I drove away from the venue, leaving behind not just Daniel and Sophie, but also the version of myself that had doubted her worth. Ahead of me lay 6 months of adventure, 12 countries to explore, and countless memories waiting to be made, all on my terms. Sure, I'd started the day thinking I'd walk away with a husband. But instead, I walked away with something far better, myself. And as the city lights faded in my rearview mirror, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning.